Part 86. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 852. What flew out of the darkness and smashed into the fire, causing sparks to fly, was a huge boulder. Guangxia Literature Network. Most of the bonfire was destroyed, and the stone rolled out of the fire and landed at Tang Ning's feet. With the remaining firelight, Tang Ning finally saw the person clearly. These dozens of people are all men. They are dressed very similar to the members of the Wuxia tribe, and they are obviously members of the Gu tribe. However, these people are not as hospitable as a duo and others. They come out of the darkness in a menacing manner, and they come with bad intentions. When many members of the Wuxia tribe saw them, their expressions immediately became nervous, as if they were facing a formidable enemy. When a young man from the Wuxia tribe saw the face of the leader opposite, his expression changed and he asked, "Wu Qing, what are you doing in my Wuxia tribe?" The man looked at him, sneered, and said, "Wu Ping, you are even more arrogant than your father was. When did Wu Shabu belong to you?" Wu Ping looked at him and said in a deep voice, "If it's not our Wuxia tribe, could it be your Wuxia tribe?" Wu Qing looked at him, a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and said, "Sooner or later it will be." Wu Ping looked at him and said angrily, "What on earth do you want to do? You don't deserve to ask me this question." Wu Qing glanced at him lightly and said, "Let your elders come out." Wu Ping had a sullen look on his face and took 2 steps forward, but was stopped by someone behind him. The person looked at him and said, "Please ask the elders to come out. This matter is not something we can get involved in." Wu Ping glanced at them unwillingly and whispered, "Go back." Tang Ning stood aside, looking confused. However, although he didn't know the guilt, it was obvious that Wu Shabu seemed to have deep grudges with these people. The Lushan festival was interrupted and even the bonfire was extinguished, so Tang Ning didn't have to worry about dancing with a duo. The uninvited guests gathered in an open space in front of the village, and everyone in the Wuxia tribe dispersed. Tang Ning and a duo returned to the stilted building, looked at her, and asked curiously, "Who are they?" A duo sighed softly, lowered his head, and said, "Wu Qing and the others were originally supposed to be members of the Wuxia tribe, but something happened to the Wuxia tribe decades ago, and their ancestors separated from the Wuxia tribe. He has been working against us for decades. After working on it for a long time, it turned out that this was a civil strife in the Wuxia tribe." From a duo's mouth, Tang Ning gradually learned more details. The Wuxia tribe has always been a branch of the 3 elders of the Wangu section since the Wuxia tribe was split into 2, a duo and his group have continued to stay here, while Wu Qing's father's branch has, after being kicked out, they broke away from the 3rd elder and joined the 4th elder. In the past few decades, they had constant friction with this lineage and often caused trouble for them. Although the 2 branches of the Wuxia tribe have broken apart, they are still from the same sect and origin. Even though the 2 branches have been in constant conflict, they have never risen to the level of life and death enemies. This time Wu Qing and others came over aggressively, and they didn't know why. For the stockade, a duo looked out the window and explained, "They have always wanted to return to the stockade. They challenge us every year. Only those who win can own the stockade, but they have never won." Tang Ning looked at her and asked strangely, "They want to challenge you, will you accept it?" A duo said, "This is a rule set by our ancestors, and no one can change it. The rules of the Gu clan are very strange. Although you can't steal something openly, you can get it through challenges. This seems to be a bit of bandit logic, but they have become accustomed to it." Tang Ning couldn't criticize other people's ethnic habits. According to what a duo said, Wu Qing and the others had almost exhausted all the clan's strength this time and were bound to capture the village. Outside the village, everyone had rekindled the bonfire, illuminating a certain square like daylight. When Tang Ning and a duo walked out, the elders of the Wuxia tribe also appeared. In the Gu clan, the elder is actually the oldest person in the tribe, which is different from the Wangu sect. The 10 elders of Wangu sect are all appointed by the previous elder to succeed them, and people are selfish, which leads to the fact that most of their elder positions are hereditary. An old man with white hair and beard walked forward, looked at Wu Qing, and asked, "Are you coming here to compete with us again?" Wu Qing snorted coldly and said, "Why, don't you dare." The elder said, "Since it is the rule set by the great elder, we must abide by it. How do you want to compare this time? Are you following the old rules?" Tang Ning looked at A Duo and asked in a low voice, "What are the old rules?" A Duo explained in a low voice, "They and we each select one of the most powerful people in the tribe to compete in Gu skills. The one who wins will win the village. The voodoo competition is much more powerful than the arm wrestling at the Lushan festival." Tang Ning had long heard that almost everyone in the Gu clan knew a little bit of voodoo skills, but she had never seen them use voodoo skills to fight. It should be different from fighting crickets and cocks. A Duo looked at Tang Ning and said, "Brother Tang, please stay away for a while. Wu Qing's Gu skills are very powerful. I'm worried that I won't be able to protect you for a while." Tang Ning took a symbolic step back, of course just to cater to A Duo. The most profound Gu techniques are in the 10,000 Gu sect, and they cannot pass them on to these fringe tribes. With Tang Ning's current Gu techniques, not to mention the best in Guizhou, but as long as she doesn't meet the 10 elders, she can run rampant. The elder looked at Wu Qing and asked, "You just came to challenge last winter. Now it's only been 3 months. Don't your elders think it's too hasty?" Wu Qing sneered, "Once a year, you don't care what month we come, just say whether you will accept it or not." "Of course I will accept it." The old man looked back and said, "Wu Ping." A young man immediately came out and bowed, "Second elder." The second elder glanced at him and said, "You were the one who fought in the last competition. This time, the village is also in your hands." Wu Ping clapped his hands and said, "I will definitely win." Wait, Wu Qing glanced at them and said, "We don't want the village this time." Wu Ping frowned and said, "Then what do you want?" Wu Qing said, "If I win, you have to give me the Gu." Bold. Insolent. When Wu Qing said this, the expressions of the second elder and Wu Ping changed drastically at the same time, and they immediately scolded him. This time, Tang Ning did not ask what a duo Gu was, because this kind of Gu insect was recorded in the 10,000 Gu poison classic. In many folk novels, Gu was said to be a magical method for Gu women to protect themselves. As long as this kind of Gu was planted on the body of their loved ones, they would never change their hearts and would live with them until old age. But reality is often much more cruel than ideal. Although Gu exists, it is not as legendary as described in novels. No kind of Gu insect can control people's hearts. Men and women like it if they like it, and they can't force it if they don't like it. Gu is a strange insect produced in Guizhou. They are hermaphroditic, with the head as male and the tail as female. After cutting off the head and tail, the male and female can survive. The lifespan of this kind of insect is extremely long, and it can easily reach decades. Some people take advantage of this characteristic of them, cut off their head and tail, and sacrifice them separately to make a pair of Gu. Plant the pair of Gu on the man and woman respectively. If they stay together all day, the male and female Gu will not separate. If the two people are separated and separated by 2 places, the male and female Gu will also be separated. In this way, they will be restless once a month, and their hosts will also suffer the pain of Gu worms gnawing their hearts around the 15th day of each month. If the host does not die, the Gu worm will not come out. Therefore, the man and woman who planted Gu on each other must accompany each other until one of them dies and the Gu worm breaks out of the body, and then the other Gu worm will drill out of the other's body. Most of them sound like fairy tales of eternal love, but in fact they are just forced realities. If the host does not die, the Gu will not come out. What Wu Qing wants is the Gu, which means that one person from the Wuxia tribe must die. Wu Ping was furious and reached out to grab his shoulder. In the firelight, a silver light came out from Wu Qing's head and went straight to Wu Ping's wrist. Ah! Wu Ping let out a painful roar and fell to the ground, curled up, looking extremely painful. The second elder's face changed drastically, and he blurted out, "Silver-threaded snake goo, you actually made a silver-threaded snake goo." People are divided into different classes, and goo is also divided into different levels. Silver-threaded snakes are very advanced goo insects. Whether it is poisoned or poisoned, it must be exposed as soon as possible, otherwise there will be danger to life. Tang Ning stepped forward, pinched Wu Ping's mouth, and sent a detoxification pill into it. A duo's face changed drastically, and she said anxiously, "Be careful." Swish! A silver line burst out from Wu Ping and flew towards Tang Ning's face. A duo looked at the silver line, and a look of despair appeared on her face. Wu Qing snorted coldly and whispered, "Don't know whether to live or die." Tang Ning raised his head and pinched the silver line, turned back to look at a duo, and asked in confusion, "What is this?" "This." Seeing the silver-threaded snake goo twisting in Tang Ning's hand, the second elder couldn't help but take a breath. The despair on a duo's face disappeared, and she looked at Tang Ning with extreme joy. On the other side, Wu Qing looked at this scene, his expression gradually becoming dull. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 853. There are differences between people, and there are also differences between goo and goo. Collect this site. There are several kinds of goo insects such as eye silkworm goo, which are highly toxic and aggressive. They are the best goo among goo, and silver line snakes are second. They are naturally superior to other goo insects. This level is not divided randomly. High-level goo insects will naturally suppress low-level goo insects. The ancestors of geese who discovered this relationship hundreds of years ago. The silver line snake is already the best among goo insects. The silver line snake of this goo is extremely precious and hard to find. It is even more difficult to refine it into a goo insect. 9 out of 10 will fail. In Gizhu, very few people have this kind of goo insect. For most goo masters, the competition of goo skills, 9 out of 10 is goo and 1 out of 10 is the skill. Even some powerful goo masters rely heavily on goo insects. Wu Qing has the silver line snake in his hand, and he is invincible in the battle with the Wuxia tribe. However, who would have thought that the silver snake, the king of goo, was casually held in someone's hand at this moment, twisting its body violently, but unable to escape. Even though Tang Ning was holding the snake's body, it never turned around to bite him. Wu Qing came back to his senses and said angrily, "You, who are you, why are you not afraid of my silver snake?" Tang Ning looked at a duo pursed her lips and asked in a low voice, "Brother Tang, why doesn't the silver snake bite you?" "So this thing is called a silver snake?" Tang Ning smiled and explained, "Maybe it's because I grew up in a medicine jar since I was a child. These snakes, insects, rats and ants never dared to approach me." Although he was not raised in a medicine jar, he was carrying an eye silkworm goo. This eye silkworm goo was not the one Su Mei had lent him before. That eye silkworm was Bai Jin's treasure. The one on Tang Ning was specially refined by Su Mei after practicing the 10,000 goo poison sutra for him to defend himself. Eye silkworm goo is a higher level goo insect than silver snake. If it is the silver snake king, it may be able to compete with it. How dare an ordinary silver snake act rashly in front of a superior, even if his eye silkworm goo is still dormant? Wu Qing looked at him and said, "Give me back the silver snake." Tang Ning has a lot of good things on him, even the eye silkworm goo, so he naturally won't snatch his silver snake. Moreover, in the goo tribe, goo insects are condensed by the owner with great effort. Taking away someone's goo insect is almost like killing their parents. Even if it is an enemy, they will not take away the other party's goo insect. This is an act that is despised by everyone. Tang Ning threw the silver snake to Wu Qing and said, "Keep your snake, don't let it run out to bite people. Even if it can't bite people, it's wrong to scare children." Wu Qing put away the silver snake and looked at him vigilantly. He thought that with the silver snake in hand, he could easily defeat Wu Ping, but he didn't expect that there was such a weird person in the Wuxia tribe, who was so abnormal that he could keep up with the speed of the silver snake, making the silver snake dare not bite him. He looked at the second elder and said in a deep voice, "How can there be a Han Chinese in the Wuxia tribe? This young doctor is a guest of our Wuxia tribe." The second elder glanced at him, then looked at Tang Ning and asked in Chinese, "Is Wu Ping okay?" "It's okay for now." Tang Ning looked at Wu Ping lying on the ground and said, "But the silver snake's poison is very tricky, and it takes a long time to prepare the antidote. For a while, I can only temporarily suppress the poison in his body." The second elder bowed to him and said, "Sorry to bother you, little doctor." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "You're too polite, elder." Wu Qing suppressed his panic, took his eyes off Tang Ning, and said, "Let's start the competition." Someone from the Wuxia tribe stood up and said indignantly, "You know Wu Ping is injured, you are taking advantage of him." Wu Qing looked at him coldly and said, "Is Wu Ping the only one in your Wuxia tribe?" The man opened his mouth and was speechless. Wu Ping is the most proficient warrior in the Wuxia tribe. Even he is not Wu Qing's opponent. Who else can be Wu Qing's opponent? The second elder looked at him and said, "It's too late today. You stay in the village first. Tomorrow morning, the competition will officially begin." Wu Qing looked at him and did not raise any objections. He turned around and walked to the corner of the square and sat cross-legged. Tang Ning followed a duo and the others back to a small building, cut Wu Ping's wrist, released the poisonous blood, and wrote down the herbs needed to understand the poison of the silver snake. Wu Ping struggled to get up from the bed and said, "Second elder, I'm fine, I can." He fell back onto the bed before he finished his sentence. "Wu Ping is injured, what should we do? Wu Qing has the silver wire snake, no one in the village can beat him. Are we going to lose this time?" There was some noise in the room. Tang Ning couldn't understand what was going on, looked at a duo, and asked, "Wu Ping will be able to recover in just 10 days, can't you postpone the time?" A duo shook her head and said, "This is the rule set by the great elder, and we can't change it. If we refuse Wu Qing's request for a competition, they will lead people to attack the village. At that time, there will be a big battle between the two villages." The second elder looked at him and added, "And Wu Qing has the silver wire snake in his hand. No one in the Wuxia tribe can restrain this gu." A duo pondered for a long time, looked at the second elder, gritted her teeth and said, "Why don't I go?" The second elder looked at her and asked, "Can you win?" A duo said, "I will be careful." "It's useless." The second elder shook his head, suddenly looked at Tang Ning, and said, "Little doctor, I have an unwelcome request, I hope you can agree." Tang Ning asked, "Elder, do you want me to compete on behalf of the Wuxia tribe?" The second elder nodded and said, "Although I don't know why Wu Qing's silver snake is afraid of you, but only you can restrain the silver snake. The little doctor has a good foundation in martial arts, and I think he can deal with Wu Qing." Tang Ning looked at him, shook his head, and said, "Competition is nothing, but I am not from your Wuxia tribe." He is willing to have a deeper relationship with the Wuxia tribe, which will also help him to further inquire about Su Mei's news, but Wu Qing is not so stupid that he will let him fight on behalf of the Wuxia tribe. From what he has observed so far, whether it is the Wuxia tribe or Wu Qing and others, they all abide by the rules set by their ancestors. If someone wants to break the rules, the other party will definitely not agree. The second elder looked at him and said, "You can be." After he finished speaking, he looked at a duo and said, "It's just that a duo will be wronged." Early morning. Wuxia tribe. Wu Qing and others stood in an open space, watching the Wuxia tribe people coming over, and asked expressionlessly, "Have you decided who to send to fight?" The second elder looked at Tang Ning and said, "Sorry to bother you, little doctor." Seeing Tang Ning coming out, Wu Qing was stunned at first, then his face changed drastically, and said, "Sending a Han Chinese to compete with me, what do you mean by the Wuxia tribe?" The second elder shook his head and said, "Although he is a Han Chinese, he is a duo's husband, so he is naturally considered a member of our Wuxia tribe. Why can't he fight on behalf of the Wuxia tribe?" Hearing this, a duo took Tang Ning's arm and looked at Wu Qing with wide eyes. When Tang Ning saw Wu Qing's expression change, he knew that what the second elder said was true. Although the Gu tribe does not have the custom of not marrying outsiders, there is an unwritten rule that Gu women cannot marry outsiders. Therefore, if a Gu woman marries a Han man must marry into the family. In this way, he is naturally considered a Gu tribe member. Last night, when the second elder proposed this suggestion, Tang Ning initially refused. This matter did not harm him, but a duo was still an unmarried girl. If this matter spread, how could she get married in the future? However, a duo did not think much about it for the sake of the village. She almost begged Tang Ning to agree. Tang Ning had no choice but to nod and agree. Only in this way can he participate in this competition that concerns the survival of the village as a member of the Wuxia tribe. Wu Qing looked at Tang Ning, his face changed. In this Wuxia tribe, the one he feared most was naturally the Han man who captured his silver snake last night. If the opponent was him, the biggest killer in his hand would be useless. But since the Wuxia tribe had already revealed his identity, he had no reason to say anything. However, the competition between the two was a Gu battle. In addition to boxing and kicking, Gu skills competition was also necessary. He glanced at Tang Ning and said in stiff Chinese, "Do you know Gu?" Tang Ning looked at him, smiled, and said, "Just a little bit." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 854. Wu Qing squeezed the joints of his hands until they cracked, looked at Tang Ning and said, "You still have a chance to regret it." Tang Ning said, "This sentence is also for you." Wu Qing looked at him deeply and walked towards the middle of the open space. A duo looked at Tang Ning worriedly and said, "Brother Tang, you have to be careful." In addition to his Gu skills, Wu Qing is also very good at boxing and kicking. Tang Ning nodded and said, "Don't worry, I also know a little bit about boxing and kicking. Fists and feet have no eyes, and Gu insects are ruthless." Before the official competition, the two have to sign an agreement. If anything happens during the competition, life or death will depend on fate, and wealth will depend on heaven. There were not many spectators nearby during this competition. After all, this was a competition of voodoo techniques. The voodoo insects attacked regardless of the opponent or the audience. The second elder stood on the sidelines, looked at Wu Qing, and reminded, "If you lose this time, you won't be able to come to Wuxia tribe until next year." Wu Qing looked at him, with a look of hatred on his face, and gritted his teeth and said, "This time, I will take back everything that should belong to us." The second elder looked at Tang Ning, bowed slightly and said, "Please." Tang Ning looked at him, nodded and said, "I'll try my best." Wu Qing's attention was entirely focused on Tang Ning. With the sound of a gong, he suddenly shook his sleeves. Two black lights shot out from his sleeves and headed straight for Tang Ning. This black light was more than 3 inches long and was completely black. When a duo saw it, he hurriedly reminded, "This is an ironback centipede. Brother Tang, be careful not to be bitten by it." Seeing the 2 centipedes flying towards him, Tang Ning stood still and did not dodge. The 2 ironback centipedes fell to the ground halfway through the flight, turned around, and quickly crawled back in the direction of Wu Qing. Wu Qing's expression was gloomy. Iron-backed centipedes and silver-threaded snakes were both afraid of him. It seemed that the man opposite him did have a restraining effect on his poisonous insects. While the centipedes crawled back, Tang Ning had already taken out a wooden box. A purple scorpion crawled out of the wooden box and chased after the two centipedes. Purple Gold Scorpion King. Wu Qing's face became even more ugly. He did not expect that the second elder would actually give his most powerful gu to this Han man. With a shake of his hand, a silver thread fell to the ground and swam quickly in the direction of the Purple Gold Scorpion King. The Purple Gold Scorpion King caught up with the centipede, and the tail hook on its back pierced the body of the iron-backed centipede. The centipede struggled a few times and then stopped moving. Just as it was about to chase another centipede, a silver line suddenly appeared in front of its eyes. The silver thread snake entangled the Purple Gold Scorpion King's tail hook. The Purple Gold Scorpion King waved its giant pincers, but could not grasp the silver thread snake's body. Obviously, although the Purple Gold Scorpion King could easily suppress the iron-backed centipede, it was not as good as the silver thread snake. Tang Ning watched this scene with great interest. During the process of refining the poison, these gu insects were fighting among countless others. Whether it was speed or toxicity, they were far beyond the ordinary ones of their kind. Although the gu tribe's medical skills are backward, they are already far ahead of other ethnic groups in refining and poisoning. Today's scene of the fight between snake and scorpion also gave him some insights. During the competition, you were actually distracted? At this moment, a cold voice came from beside him. Wu Qing didn't know when he had already walked around Tang Ning. While speaking, he punched Tang Ning directly in the face. A duo exclaimed from below, "Brother Tang, be careful." When Tang Ning's fist was about to land on his face, she casually stretched out her hand to hold it, applied a slight force, and turned it in an arc. Wu Qing's body turned to the side uncontrollably. The man named Rhonda watched the scene from a distance and couldn't help but shake his hands, remembering again the fear of being dominated by that strange force last night. Wu Qing seemed not to have expected that Tang Ning's seemingly weak body would actually contain such a large amount of energy. One of his arms hurt, and the other hand bent his knees into an elbow and slammed into her. Tang Ning grabbed his other wrist and kicked him in the calf. Wu Qing knelt on the ground. Tang Ning pointed at his shoulder again. His body went numb and he could no longer exert any strength. Everyone in the Wuxia tribe looked at the scene blankly. They originally thought that the village could not be saved this time, but who would have thought that Wu Qing could not survive 3 moves in the hands of the little doctor? This is not a competition of the same level at all, this is crushing. Tang Ning looked at Wu Qing and said, "You lose." Tang Ning and Wu Qing decided the winner, and the silver thread snake and the purple gold scorpion king also gave up the fight. The second elder accepted the purple gold scorpion king, and the silver thread snake got into Wu Qing's sleeve and disappeared. A duo ran over from the side and asked, "Brother Tang, are you okay?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "What can I do?" Wu Qing struggled to get up from the ground, glanced at the second elder, and said, "You actually let a Han take action, you have completely embarrassed Wu Qing's tribe." The second elder glanced at him and said, "With your ability, you can't even train a silver-threaded snake." Although Wu Qing and others came with bad intentions, they did not admit their defeat after losing the written test. He gave everyone a vicious look, gritted his teeth and said, "Let's go." "Wait a minute." They had just taken a few steps when an old voice came from behind. Wu Qing turned around, looked at the old man walking from a distance, and mocked, "Why, does the third elder want to keep us here?" The third elder glanced at him and said, "First elder, please come over." "What?" The second elder was shocked when he heard this, with a look of surprise on his face, and asked, "How could the great elder?" The third elder looked at him and said, "This is what the great elder meant." Wu Qing's face also showed surprise. The third elder stretched out his hand to him and said, "Let's go, I will take you there." Wu Qing glanced at him and quickly followed him away without hesitating for long. When Tang Ning and A Duo walked back, A Duo turned to look at him and said, "Brother Tang, you are so awesome." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "It's just so." A Duo looked at him, thought for a moment, and suddenly asked, "Brother Tang, are you really a doctor?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "That's right. In addition to occasionally helping people see doctors, I also do business and travel around." A Duo asked curiously, "Has Brother Tang been to many places?" Tang Ning said, "Not too many. Apart from Chen State, I have only been to Chu State and the grasslands." "So many," A Duo said with envy in his eyes. "The farthest place I have ever been is Tongzhou. If you have the opportunity in the future, you must go out and see more." Tang Ning looked at her and said, "The outside world is big and exciting. It would be boring to live in the mountains all your life. In 2 years' time, I want to see the grassland." A Duo said with a look of expectation on his face, "There are mountains and trees here. I want to see what the endless grassland looks like." She sighed, then looked at Tang Ning and asked, "Brother Tang didn't come to Guizhou just to look for medicinal materials, right?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "Actually, it's to find someone." A Duo asked curiously, "Who are you looking for?" Tang Ning smiled and said, "Look for my wife." A Duo asked in surprise, "Is Mrs. Tang in Kandy?" Tang Ning nodded and said, "I only know that she is in Guizhou, but I don't know where she is specifically." A smile broke out on A Duo's face and he said, "Brother Tang, don't worry, you will definitely find your wife. I will help you find her." Tang Ning and A Duo walked all the way back and were greeted warmly by everyone. Wu Qing walked in with the second elder and the third elder in the tallest stilted building in the Wuxia tribe. The furnishings in the building are very simple, with only a bamboo bed, a bamboo cabinet, and a bamboo chair. There was a man lying on the bamboo bed. He was an old man. Judging from the brown spots on his face, he was already very old. In fact, at nearly 100 years old, he is indeed the oldest person in the Wuxia tribe and the great elder of the Wuxia tribe. He is the belief of everyone in the Wuxia tribe. The old man lay on the bed, turned his head with difficulty, looked at Wu Qing, and asked, "Is she okay?" Wu Qing glanced at him and said, "She is going to die." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 855. A Duo was very curious about everything outside and asked Tang Ning a lot about Chen Chu and the grassland. A Duo was about the same age as Xiao Xiao, and her personality was more cheerful. When Tang Ning mentioned the past with her, some places were mentioned in just a few words. However, A Duo still got some different information from his words. She looked at Tang Ning and said in great surprise, "Brother Tang, you have been an official and been on the battlefield." "Just a minor official." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "I only managed a few soldiers, not worth mentioning." A Duo looked at him with admiration and said, "Brother Tang is so good at everything he does." Tang Ning has indeed done many things. He has served as an envoy to send relatives, served as an imperial envoy to quell rebellions, and fought as a marshal. Now his identity has become a secret spy. He just abducted one of Chen Wang's daughters, and he treated her like a brick. She could be moved wherever she needed to go, which made her cry bitterly. After he sat in the small building for a while, someone came in, looked at him, and said in Chinese, "Little doctor, the elder has invited me." Tang Ning learned from A Duo that the great elder was the most noble person in the Wuxia tribe. When he was young, he led the Wuxia tribe out of the harsh mountains and harsh waters, opened up this terraced field, and built the current village. Today's Wuxia tribe. The great elder is now nearly 100 years old. Even in later generations, he will be regarded as a long-lived old man. The oldest old beggar is also a junior among the juniors in front of him. The air in Guizhou is fresh and the scenery is outstanding. The Gu people live longer than the Han people living outside. Of course, Even so, a centenarian like the Great Elder can be regarded as a living fossil in the mountains. Atuo accompanied him out of the small building and said, "Brother Tang, you don't have to be afraid, the elder is very kind." The old beggar was slumped in the corner outside drinking. The wine produced by the Gu clan has a different taste in each family. After Tang Ning rescued Ata and Aer yesterday, the members of the Wuxia tribe sent dozens of jars of wine. The old beggar has been paralyzed there since yesterday afternoon, tasting all the wines one by one. Tang Ning gave him a look. Although he was considered a benefactor of the Wuxia tribe and the Gu tribe was also a hospitable people, it was always good to be more cautious in other people's territory. With the old beggar, he could handle any changes. The old beggar raised his head and took a few sips of wine. When Tang Ning gave him a third look, he finally looked at him and asked, "Is there something wrong with your eyes?" Tang Ning once again felt that bringing the old beggar out was the biggest mistake in his profession. He walked over and pulled him up and said, "Follow me to a place." The old beggar smelled of alcohol and was being dragged by Tang Ning as he staggered around. He followed the man towards the stilted building above. "Little doctor." "Hello, little doctor." Along the way, people poked their heads out of the stilted building from time to time and greeted him in blunt Chinese. Tang Ning waved to them, and not long after, she arrived in front of a stilted building. This is the highest attic in the entire village. Standing here, you can overlook the scenery of the entire village. Tang Ning stood in front of the small building and looked at it for a while. Then someone walked out of the building and said, "Little doctor, the elder has invited you." Tang Ning dragged the old beggar in and found that the furnishings in this building were extremely simple. They were just bamboo tables, bamboo chairs, bamboo cabinets, and bamboo beds. There was an old man lying on the bed. There were few hairs on the old man's head and there were large age spots on his face. The moment she saw the old man, Tang Ning suddenly felt heart palpitations. At the same time, the dormant eye silkworm Gu in his sleeve suddenly woke up and became uneasy. Tang Ning looked at the source of the throbbing feeling, the old man on the bamboo bed. He could feel that there was something extremely terrifying inside the old man's body. The old man's eyes stayed on Tang Ning for a long time, then he looked at the two servants standing in the small building and said, "You guys go down first." Tang Ning was a little surprised. This old man was so old, but he still spoke with a strong voice and didn't look old at all. The two of them bowed and bowed before slowly retreating and closing the door behind them. The old man looked at Tang Ning again and said, "No wonder you were able to restrain Wu Qing's silver-threaded snake. With the eye silkworm Gu here, how could they dare to do something wrong?" Just now he was speaking the language of the Gu clan, but now he was speaking Chinese. Apart from Gong Sun Ying, this old man was the first one to guess that Tang Ning was pregnant with eye silkworm Gu without exposing him. A hint of admiration appeared on Tang Ning's face and she said, "This old man really has a sharp eye." The old man looked at him and asked, "Which elder sent you here? Are you also here for love Gu?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "No one sent me here. It's just a coincidence that we are in the Wuxia tribe." "I think so." The old man looked at the old beggar and said, "If you really want something, you can just take it. No one is who can stop you." The old beggar burped, slumped on the chair, and fell asleep. The moment she entered the small building, Tang Ning knew that the love Gu that Wu Qing wanted was inside the great elder's body. This love Gu has survived in his body for at least a century. Under the long-term warmth of his essence and blood, it has become extremely powerful. It is so powerful that even the eye silkworm Gu, the king of Gus, is aware of the danger. What was horrifying to think about was that Tang Ning didn't notice the presence of another love Gu near him. Could it mean that the old man in front of him would suffer from a heart-gnawing Gu on the 15th day of every month? Judging from his age, he has been suffering from this unbearable pain for at least several decades. Tang Ning looked at the old man and asked, "How long has the male Gu in the Great Elder been separated from the female Gu?" The great elder smiled and said, I'm old, I can't remember whether it's 75 or 76 years. When Tang Ning heard this, her body trembled. For 75 years, 12 times a year, doesn't it mean that he has suffered nearly 1,000 times of love poison? For a person, it would be better to die happily. The great elder looked at him with turbid eyes and said, I can ask you a favor. Tang Ning asked, what's the matter? The great elder said, please send the love goo in my body to someone. As long as the host doesn't die, the love goo can't come out. Tang Ning looked at him and said, you will die if you do this. Death is not a good thing for me. The great elder smiled and said, love goo is too attractive to some people. I am worried that the little guys in the tribe cannot protect it. When they were young, love goo was just a token used by men and women of the goo tribe to make lifelong promises. Love gus that have lived for 70 or 80 years are different. They absorb nutrients from the host's body and continue to grow. They can be called the emperors among gus. One of them can travel across Gizhu. If there is a pair, all the gus can be conquered. All will surrender before them. And this love goo is still alive, which means that there is another female goo somewhere in Gizhu province, presumably in the body of the person the great elder just mentioned. Before Tang Ning agreed, the first elder looked outside the building and said, everyone, come in. Not long after he finished speaking, the second elder and the third elder walked in from outside. He looked at the second elder and said, there is only one Wuxia tribe. What happened back then is not her fault. Let them come back. The second elder nodded and said, respect the elder's order. The great elder looked at Tang Ning and smiled, please. After saying that, he slowly closed his eyes. The expressions of the second elder and the third elder suddenly changed, and they lost their voices and said, great elder. As soon as they finished speaking, the great elder's chest suddenly began to rise and fall. A foot-long, brown insect emerged from his chest, turned into an afterimage, and shot towards the door. Call out. Wherever it passed, even the air made a sound like cracking silk. The old beggar, who was in a fugue state, suddenly woke up, stretched out 2 fingers, and thrust them forward suddenly. Hey! There was a harsh hiss in the air. The old beggar looked at the bugs struggling between his fingers, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, where did the bugs come from? Can I use them to make wine? Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 856. Ugh. After hearing that the goo worm came out of a dead body, the old beggar leaned on the railing outside the small building and vomited all the wine from the previous night. Crazy Sand Literature Network. The second and third elders of the Wuxia tribe looked at him with fear. The person who could catch a mature goo with 2 fingers had strength beyond their imagination. After regaining his composure, the second elder came over and handed a bamboo tube to Tang Ning, saying, little doctor, I'll leave the goo to you. Obviously, they also heard the conversation between Tang Ning and the first elder just now. Tang Ning did not refuse, took the bamboo tube, stood on the corridor outside the small building, and overlooked the tribe below. After the death of the great elder, there were bursts of wailing in the small building behind. After a while, a duo came out of the building with red eyes, looked at Tang Ning, and choked up and said, Brother Tang, the great elder has passed away. Tang Ning gently patted her shoulder to comfort her. The great elder was the belief and pillar of the Wuxia tribe. His death made the whole tribe fall into a sad atmosphere. Wu Qing stood outside the small building blankly, his face blank, and he was a little at a loss. Tang Ning walked over and asked, Is the other goo with you? Wu Qing looked up at him, came back to his senses, nodded slightly, and said, The elder's health is getting worse day by day. Without this goo, he can't get through the 15th of this month. There is a saying that when 2 people are together, the deeper the love is, when they are apart, the deeper the hatred is. Both of them had suffered from the pain of the goo for decades, but they were unwilling to meet each other. The two tribes had been at loggerheads for so many years. This was the Gu tribe. They treated people well, but in some matters, they were almost paranoid and unwilling to give in. The funeral of the great elder took 3 days to prepare, and his coffin was placed on a cliff in the mountain stream. This was a unique funeral custom of the Gu tribe. The cliff was steep and dangerous, with a deep stream below, and it was impossible to climb. This was the cemetery of the Wuxia tribe. The higher the position of the coffin, the more respect the living had for the dead. The great elder's coffin was located at the highest position on the cliff. After burying the great elder, the people of the Wuxia tribe sent the Gu to Wu Qing's tribe according to his last wish. In addition to the second and third elders, the Wuxia tribe also sent 10 young and strong men to accompany them. Tang Ning walked in front, looked back at the second elder, and asked, "What's going on with that female elder and the first elder?" The second elder breathed a sigh of relief, and did not hide anything. He said, "In order to compete for the saint, Elder Tian killed several tribesmen in the tribe and committed an unforgivable mistake. The first elder drove her out of the tribe according to the tribe rules. When she left, she took half of the tribe members and reorganized the new Wuxia tribe. Over the past few decades, there have been constant disputes with our tribe." What the second elder said was 70 or 80 years ago. This is also the reason why Wu Qing's tribe has been fighting with them for decades. Tang Ning also got more information from his words that he didn't know before. The Gu tribe is good at raising Gu, and the birth of Gu worms is to put various poisonous insects together and let them fight each other. In the end, only the most poisonous one is left, and the rest of the poisonous insects will become victims in the process of refining Gu. The Wan Gu sex choice of the saint is another form of refining Gu. Before the selection of the saint, each of the 10 tribes will nominate a woman as one of the saint candidates. At that time, the 10 of them will bring several followers and enter a dangerous place. The one who can finally come out alive will be the next saint. The rest of the saint candidates will either submit to the saint or sacrifice themselves to the Gu. The fierce competition is no less fierce than the fighting between Gu insects during the Gu refining process. 80 years ago, there was such a saint candidate in the Wuxia tribe. In the process of competing for the saint, she sacrificed her followers for the position of saint, but in the end she did not win the position of saint. After that, she was expelled from the Wuxia tribe, driven out of the tribe, and separated from the great elder. Even though the two had planted the Gu, they never interacted with each other and hated each other for 80 years. Wu Qing heard this, looked at the second elder, and said, "The elder is also for the tribe. If you can become a saint, you will have the opportunity to grow the tribe. What's the point of sacrificing a few people?" The second elder looked at him coldly and said, "It's better not to do the saint in exchange for the sacrifice of the tribe." Wu Qing opened his mouth, but didn't say anything. This is the family affair of the Wuxia tribe. Tang Ning couldn't comment on it. There was no need to discuss whether it was worthwhile to exchange the tribe for the saint. After all, 80 years have passed. The female elder at that time did not get the position of saint in the end. The disposal made by the great elder in accordance with the tribe rules was understandable. There is no point in arguing about these. What he has to do now is to send the male Gu of the Gu to that person so that she will not suffer from the pain of the Gu worm in the future, which can be regarded as fulfilling the great elder's last wish. This part of the Wuxia tribe lived halfway away from a Duo's tribe. Tang Ning and his team set out early in the morning and arrived in the afternoon. Wu Qing walked to the gate of the village and said a few words to the guards. They opened the gate and Tang Ning and others walked in slowly. The tribesmen of this tribe were not very polite to the Wuxia tribe. When they saw them, most of them turned their heads away and ignored them without even saying hello. Wu Qing led them to a stilt house and said, "The elder is inside." Tang Ning and the second elder and others walked in and saw an old woman lying on a recliner in the building. The old woman's face was already full of brown spots, and her skin was loose and attached to her bones. She looked at the few people coming in with a sharp look in her eyes. There was a hint of expectation hidden in the depths of her eyes. She looked at the second elder and asked, "I feel it, it's here, where is Ge Lu, let him come out to see me." The second elder looked at her and said, "The eldest elder has passed away." What? The old woman was struck by lightning, her body trembled, and she struggled to get up from the recliner, grabbed the second elder's wrist, and said angrily, "What did you say? How did he die? How could Ge Lu die?" Tang Ning handed the bamboo tube to the second elder, and the second elder took the bamboo tube and said, "Before the eldest elder left, let us send the gu to you." The old woman looked at the bamboo tube, and when she felt the things in the tube, she fell back into the recliner, and her eyes lost color. If the host is not dead, the gu will not come out. If the gu breaks the body, it means that its owner is dead. The old woman lay weakly on the recliner, and said hoarsely, "You will never see me even if you die, you will never see me even if you die." The second elder put the bamboo tube on the table, looked at Tang Ning, and said, "Let's go. I was wrong, I was wrong. Don't die, we agreed to die together." When Tang Ning and the second elder walked out of the small building, the old woman was still saying something, but he could not understand it very well. They walked outside and saw the third elder arguing with an old man. The third elder was angry and said, "This is what the elder meant." The old man snorted and said, "That's your elder." The third elder reminded, "Don't forget, you are also from the Wuxia tribe." That was in the past. The old man looked at him and said, "Why should we go when he drives us away and go back when he asks us to go back?" Tang Ning shook his head. The two gangs of the Wuxia tribe had too deep a grudge. It would not be easy to fulfill the elder's other last wish. He walked down the steps and suddenly heard some music coming from behind. Tang Ning had just heard the sound of the reed pipe not long ago. He looked at the second elder and asked, "Where is the reed pipe playing?" The second elder turned around and looked at the stilled house above and said, "Elder Tian has passed away." The old woman also passed away, quietly dying on the recliner. Some things in this world are really fate. The elder committed suicide just to get out the poisonous insect and save her life. However, when Tang Ning sent the gu worms, the final outcome was like this. When one gu was nearby, the other one would not go crazy. After the old woman died, the gu worms broke out of her body and were easily caught in the bamboo tube. At the entrance of the village, Wu Qing held two bamboo tubes in his hand, looked at the second elder with a complicated expression, and said, "Before the elder dies, let us hand over this pair of gu worms to you." The second elder sighed lightly, and was about to reach out to take it, when a silver light suddenly flew out from Wu Qing's sleeve and bit the second elder's wrist. The second elder's face changed drastically, and he said angrily, "Wu Qing, you." Wu Qing showed a confused look on his face, and murmured, I don't know, how could the silver snake?" The people of the Wuxia tribe who followed the second elder had already drawn their weapons, and angrily said to Wu Qing and the few people behind him, "Wu Qing, you despicable villain." Wu Qing looked flustered and explained, "No, it's not me. You dare to quibble." The incident happened suddenly, and the two gangs held weapons and faced each other from a distance, as if a conflict would break out in the next moment. At this time, Tang Ning walked up slowly and waved to the people of the Wuxia tribe, signaling them to put down their weapons. A duo looked at him and said puzzledly, "Brother Tang." Tang Ning gave her a look, looked at a dense forest in front of the village, and said, "Have you seen enough? Come out if you have seen enough." You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 857. Wu Qing and the others and the Wuxia tribe stared at Tang Ning blankly, and then they all looked at the dense forest in front of them. Guangxia Literature Network. Tang Ning threw a pill that temporarily suppressed the silver snake venom to the second elder, looked at the dense forest again, and said, "Why, do you want me to invite you out?" Swish. A silver light shot out from the second elder's body and disappeared into the dense forest in front. After a while, the sound of rustling footsteps came from the forest. More than a dozen shadows walked out of the forest, led by a young man. He looked at Tang Ning with a twinkling eye and asked in surprise, "How did you find me?" This person wore the traditional costume of the Gu tribe, and like a duo, he spoke good Chinese. Wu Qing looked at the young man, and was startled at first, then he said angrily, "Xinju, it's you." The young man named Xinju stretched out a finger, and the silver snake wrapped around it. He looked at Wu Qing and smiled, "Brother Wu Qing, the great elder of the Wuxia tribe is dead, and the remaining two elders are here. Why don't we join forces to keep them here completely? From now on, there will only be you Wuxia tribe here." The people of the Wuxia tribe changed their faces when they heard this, and immediately helped the second elder up and kept a distance from Wu Qing and others. "This is our Wuxia tribe's family affair, so you and the fourth elder don't have to worry about it." Before Wu Qing spoke, the old man who had just argued with the third elder came out and said to the young man. He said the words of the Gu tribe. Tang Ning didn't understand it all, but he also heard the word fourth elder. The elders of the Gu tribe are divided into two types. Each tribe has its own elders, but the elders mentioned by the old man are obviously the fourth elders of the Wangu sect. Xinju looked at him, shook his head, and said, "Since the day you pledged allegiance to the fourth elder, your affairs are our affairs. Otherwise, why would I lend such a precious poisonous insect as the silver snake to Wu Qing?" The old man looked at him and asked, "What do you want to do?" "It's very simple." Xinju smiled, looked at the two bamboo tubes in Wu Qing's hand, and said, "Give me this pair of poisonous insects, and we will leave immediately. You can handle your own family affairs of the Wuxia tribe. Don't even think about it." Wu Qing quickly put away the two bamboo tubes and said in a deep voice, "How can you get something for nothing in this world?" Xinju glanced at him and said, "Don't be so stingy. I'll lend you the silver snake, and you lend me the Gu. That's reasonable. So your goal has always been the Gu." The old man looked at him and said, "You have ulterior motives. From now on, my clan and the four elders have no relationship. Go away. If you don't leave, don't blame me for being rude." "Oh," Xinju smiled and said, "I want to see how rude you are." As he finished speaking, more people came out of the forest. They were wearing blue and purple robes. When they saw these people, the faces of several elders changed at the same time. Tang Ning learned from a duo that in Guizhou, almost everyone knows some Gu techniques, but there are very few people who have practiced it to a high level. These people who have been immersed in Gu for many years and have a high level of Gu techniques are called Gu masters. Gu masters also have different levels. In the Wangu sect, except for the 10 elders who have transcended the category of Gu masters, the rest of the people are distinguished by the color of their clothes. Those who wear blue and purple clothes are very powerful Gu masters. In the Wuxia tribe, only the second and third elders can barely be regarded as purple-clothed level. And the opponent's purple-clothed Gu masters, there are more than 10. These people's target is Gu. The two elders have passed away, and the Gu is temporarily without a master, but they only need to feed it with their own blood for a while, and they can make the Gu recognize the master again. At that time, they will have 2 more Gu kings in their hands. If they only fight Gu with Gu, even if Tang Ning has eye silkworm Gu, he is not a match for a pair of Gu. The mantis stalks the cicada, and the oriole is behind. However, anyone who wants to be the oriole must be prepared to be caught. In the village behind, many young and strong people have already rushed out, standing behind Wu Qing and others, looking at Xinju and others with nervous expressions. Xianju looked at the elders and said, I just want the goo. Give it to me and I won't make it difficult for you. The second elder looked at him and said, this is a relic left by the two elders to the tribe. We can't give it to you. Xianju looked at another old man in Wuqing's tribe and asked, what do you mean? The old man stood next to the second elder and said, his meaning is my meaning. That's a pity. Xianju shook his head, waved to the people behind him, and said, give me the goo. As for these people, kill them, and don't leave any alive. The purple-clothed and blue-clothed goo masters behind him heard this and began to make strange noises from their mouths. Strange sounds. At the same time, countless poisonous insects began to crawl out from their robes, and rustling sounds were heard in the surrounding bushes. Wuqing's face changed, and he hurriedly said, hurry up and take out the poison. It's useless. The old man shook his head and said, the poison didn't recognize the master, and they will run away if you take it out. After he finished speaking, he looked at the second elder and said, old man, if you have any tricks, take them out as soon as possible, otherwise our Wuxia tribe will be exterminated today. The second elder looked at Tangning, bowed slightly, and said, little doctor, thank you for your trouble. Tangning took out a box from his sleeve and handed it to the second elder. After the second elder took it respectfully, he took 2 steps forward and stood in front of everyone. He took something out of the box and put it in his palm. It was a white insect, crystal clear and like white jade. The rustling sound on the ground stopped abruptly, stagnated for a moment, and then sounded again. It was just that the goo worm that had just crawled out retreated in the direction it came from at a faster speed. The silver snake wrapped around Xianju's finger also seemed to have encountered a powerful enemy and quickly slipped into his sleeve. Xianju looked at the thing in the palm of the second elder's hand. After a moment of daze, his face showed ecstasy and he said in a lost voice, I silkworm goo. The eye silkworm goo is a more advanced goo worm than the silver silkworm. It is a rare goo that has both offensive and defensive capabilities. Wherever it goes, thousands of goo surrender. Ordinary goo worms will retreat when they feel its breath. It can be said that ordinary goo masters, with eye silkworm goo, are naturally invincible. Unexpectedly, he had been planning for 2 goo for so long, and he could still have such a big unexpected gain. If he had the eye silkworm goo in his hand, why would he risk letting the goo recognize his master? He had a fire in his eyes and said, I want this eye silkworm goo. With the eye silkworm goo, all the goo techniques were useless, because their goo worms would not listen to them at all. The dozens of people behind him took out their weapons and rushed forward. The use of goo techniques is to be used in a strange way. The eye silkworm goo can defeat all goo, but not people. If you only practice goo techniques without martial arts, you cannot become a high-level goo master. Therefore, a powerful goo master, in addition to having a high level of goo techniques, must also have good martial arts. Looking at the enemy approaching them, Tang Ning pushed the old beggar who was dozing beside him and said, wake up, it's time to live. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 858. Tang Ning was very happy. This time when she went out, the old beggar who encountered troubles and was unreliable finally became reliable this time. Within a few breaths, he was alone, and everyone across from him, including Xianju, was lying on the ground, unconscious. After doing all this, the old beggar burped, leaned against the wall of the village, and continued to take a nap. Everyone in the Wuxia tribe stood there, dumbfounded. Tang Ning waved her hand in front of Wu Qing's eyes and said, stop being stunned, tie them all up. Oh! Wu Qing came back to his senses and nodded dully. He glanced at the old beggar who was napping against the door, his eyes full of reverence and fear. Xianju and others were tied up in the woods in front of the village. At Tang Ning's signal, Wu Qing splashed him with a ladle of cold water to wake him up. He glanced at Tang Ning, then turned his eyes back again and asked, "Tell me, why do you want the love goo?" Xianju was woken up by the cold water, looked at him, and said angrily, "You Wuxia tribe dare to rebel, the fourth elder will not let you go." Wu Qing took out an iron-back centipede from his arms, waved it in front of his eyes, and said, "I don't want to ask you a second time. If you don't say anything, I'll let Taibei ask you." "How dare you?" Xianju's expression became even more angry, but when he saw Wu Qing actually put the iron-back centipede on his head, his expression immediately changed and he said, "Love goo is useful to us in our fight for the saint. If we can make them recognize their master, then no one will be Niju's opponent." Wu Qing related to Tang Ning in Chinese. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Who is Niju?" Wu Qing said, "The fourth elder's granddaughter and Xianju's sister is also one of the candidates for the saint this time." Xianju looked at him and said, "Hurry up and let me go. If I don't go back today, my grandmother will come here in person." Xianju's grandmother was the fourth elder of Wangu section. Wu Qing's expression changed when he heard this. Tang Ning looked at Wu Qing and asked, "What did he say?" Wu Qing said, "He said that if he is not allowed to go back, the fourth elder will come in person. The fourth elder is his grandmother." "Then let's go." Tang Ning glanced at Xianju and said, "I just have something to ask her. The fight for the saint is a major secret of the Wangu section except for the 10 elders, no one knows the specific details. If the fourth elder came over, Tang Ning could ask her what the process of selecting a saint in their 10,000 Gu sect was like. Although he didn't know where Sumei was, he could know when and where she would go." Wu Qing looked at him and asked, "What if the fourth elder doesn't come over?" Tang Ning said, "Then let someone tell her that if she doesn't come over, we will kill her grandson." Ancient Spiritual Department. The Gu tribe has dozens of tribes of various sizes, scattered throughout Guizhou province. There are small tribes like the Wuxia tribe with only a few hundred people, and there are also large tribes like the Guling tribe with a population of more than 10,000. The size of the ancient spirit tribe is at the forefront even if we look at the entire Gu clan. The great elder of the ancient spirit tribe is the fourth elder of the 10,000 Gu section. Although the 10,000 Gu sect has fallen apart, without the restraint of the saint, the top 10 the actual power of the elders is greater, and the small tribes surrounding their tribe are almost all attached to a certain elder. In the ancient spiritual department, in a stilted building somewhere, a woman looked at the old woman sitting cross-legged on the bed and asked, "Grandma, since love goo is so important to our fight for the saint, why don't you go to the Wuxia department to get it yourself?" The old woman slowly opened her eyes and said, "The pair of love goo has existed in the bodies of those two old guys for 80 years. It is not an exaggeration to call them the kings of goo. Any goo will be suppressed by them. Even I am not sure." The woman looked outside and said, "Xianju has been gone for so long, why hasn't he come back yet?" The old woman said, "Aren't you still worried about Xianju's work?" "That's not true." The woman shook her head and said, "It's just that even if the matter is difficult, he should still send the news back." As soon as he finished speaking, someone hurried in and said, "There is news from Xianju." After a moment, the woman looked at one person, her face suddenly sank, and asked, "What did you say?" The man looked at her and said tremblingly, "Someone shot a letter with an arrow. The letter said that Xianju and the others were captured. If we don't give them the silver thread Snake King, they will kill Xianju." The woman couldn't figure out the passage. There are so many people like Xianju, how could they be captured by a mere Wuxia tribe? The man lowered his head and said, "That's what the letter said." The woman looked at the old woman and murmured, "Xianju is surrounded by 10 people in purple clothes. It is impossible for him to be captured by the Wuxia tribe. Is there any fraud in this?" The old woman's face was calm, but there was a hint of murderous intent in her eyes, and she said, "Just go and see if it's a scam." Wuxia Department. In order to avoid the fourth elder of Wangu sect, Wu Qing had led the tribe to move here. The two tribes were originally one family. From then on, there was only one Wuxia tribe in Guizhou. Tang Ning stood in front of Xianju, pulled off the rag from Xianju's mouth, looked at a duo, and said, "Ask him for me, where are those candidates for the sainthood competing for the sainthood?" After a long journey, Xianju was exhausted, tired and hungry. He shook his head and said weakly, I don't know. This is a secret that only the top 10 elders know. You, please let go already." Before he could finish speaking, a duo stuffed the rag into Xianju's mouth again, shook his head at Tang Ning and said, "He said that only the top 10 elders know this secret. It seems that if you want to get the news about Sumei, you must meet this fourth elder. I don't know if she cares about her grandson or whether she will come in person." Tang Ning looked at a duo and said, "Everyone, please brace yourself for patrol at night. The fourth elder is very likely to come here to seek revenge." Such a big change occurred in the tribe, and the young men of the Wuxia tribe came out in full force to patrol around and in the village without any slack. After all, when the Wangu sect was still at its peak and the Liang kingdom had not yet been destroyed, the fourth elder was already one of the top 10 elders. In the past few decades, the elders from other lines have changed again and again, but the fourth elder has remained firmly among the top 10 elders. He is the oldest among the 10 elders today. At the entrance of the village, several young people gathered together on patrol and talked in low voices. "Do you think the fourth elder will come?" "Impossible." "Who is the fourth elder? How could he come to our Wuxia tribe in person?" "But Xianju is her only grandson." "What if she?" One of them shivered, waved his hand and said, "Don't scare yourself, how could there be so many 10,000? Before he could finish his sentence, he fell softly to the ground and became silent again. "How powerful! How can you?" Several people beside him, just as he spoke, their feet weakened and fell to the ground. A figure walked out of the darkness, stepped over them as if nothing had happened, and slowly walked into the village. In the village, a young man on patrol noticed something unusual. He looked at an old woman in front of him and said loudly, "Who are you?" Before he finished speaking, the old woman choked him. The old woman looked at him calmly and asked, "Where is Xianju?" The young man covered his throat with one hand, raised his other hand with difficulty, and pointed to the stilt building at the top. The old woman let go of her hand, and the young man fell to the ground, twitched a few times, and then passed out. The old woman walked towards the stilted building on the top of the mountain. When she met the people who came forward to question her, she did not give way. She did not see any movement. Anyone who came close to her fell to the ground unconscious. No one could stop the old woman, and soon she reached the stilted building. She went up the stairs and heard a noise coming from the room inside. "Don't boil scorpions in our pot. Not even a centipede. Go and cook it in your own pot." This was the voice of a young man, followed by the old man's muttering, "My pot hasn't boiled yet, don't be so stingy, just boil one." "Get out," the young man's voice was unceremonious. "This is Candy," and the people in the room actually spoke Chinese. The old woman opened the door, and the young man squatting in front of the copper pot looked up, looked at the girl next to him, and said, "Who is this, my old lady? Why don't you invite her over to eat with us?" A duo turned pale and said in a trembling voice, he is not from our village." Xianju was tied to a pillar in the corner of the room. When he saw her, he burst into tears and shouted loudly, "Grandma, save me, save me." Tang Ning stood up, looked at the old woman, and asked, "Fourth elder?" The old woman looked at Tang Ning, with a strange look on her face, and said slowly in Chinese, "No wonder Xianju and the others are no match for you. You actually have eye silkworm goo." When Tang Ning wasn't paying attention, the old beggar threw a centipede and 2 scorpions into his and a duo's pot. Then he turned to look at the old woman, scratched his head, and asked, "The little girl looks familiar, Have you seen it somewhere? The old woman looked at the old beggar and felt that he was familiar to him, but she couldn't remember where and when she had seen him before. The old beggar looked at her, suddenly slapped his head, and suddenly realized, look at my memory, I almost didn't recognize you when you put on clothes. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Wrong Xiao Wrong. Chapter 859. Shut up. Hearing the old beggar say dirty words to the old woman, Xianju said angrily, how dare you talk to the fourth elder like this? Tang Ning glanced at the old beggar and said, this sister looks familiar and I have seen this sister before. This kind of pick-up routine was a bit cliché. Moreover, he actually struck up a conversation with the fourth elder of Wangu section. This attitude really made Tang Ning suspicious. Tang Ning coughed slightly and signaled him to pay attention to his stance. They and this old woman are enemies rather than friends. If the old beggar is addicted to beauty, they will be completely wiped out this time. Court death. Although the old woman had not yet remembered who the old man was across from her, this was the first time in her life that someone dared to say something frivolous to her. She snorted coldly, raised her hand, and a ray of silver light shot out from her hand, heading straight for him. The old man left. Because she had anger in her heart, she would kill with her attack. The body of a silver thread snake is as thin as a hair, and it is extremely difficult to find. Only 10 silver thread snakes can refine a silver thread snake voodoo, and 100 silver thread snake voodoos may not produce a silver thread snake king. The silver thread snake king is extremely poisonous and will seal its throat at the sight of blood. There is no way to save it. Even if there is medicine, it will not leave the other party any time to save it. Because the moment he was poisoned, he was already dead. The silver-threaded snake is extremely fast, but no matter how fast it is, it can't be faster than the old beggar's chopsticks. The old beggar stretched out his hand, caught the silver light with his chopsticks, and stuffed it into the boiling copper pot in front of him. Tang Ning saw a centipede, 2 scorpions, and a struggling little snake floating in his Na-duo's hot pot. She looked at the old beggar with dissatisfaction. Since coming to Gizhu, she has eaten a lot of delicacies given by others. After the bugs, he didn't know when he would change his habit of boiling bugs whenever he saw them. The old woman looked at the silver-threaded snake king who floated completely in the copper pot without struggling for a long time. Her expression became dull. The next moment, she suddenly remembered something. That was decades ago. At that time, she was still the youngest elder of the Wangu sect. That year, the Liang kingdom was still there. That year, the Wangu sect was strong and powerful, with followers all over Gizhu. It was also that year that a young beggar broke into the main altar of the 10,000 Gu sect, defeated the saint, and stole the 10,000 Gu poison scripture. The 10 elders chased them dozens of miles away, but he took off their clothes. Tied to a tree. Although he also left her a piece of underwear, it was still an unforgettable shame and an undying fear in her life. She finally realized what the old beggar meant by what he just said. At this moment, she no longer cared about the love gu, the eye silkworm gu, or Xianju. She just wanted to escape, as far away from that person as possible. However, as soon as she turned around, a voice came from behind. Are you just leaving like that? She turned around stiffly, looked at the old man, and said tremblingly, what else do you want to do? The old beggar came over with a bowl and said, do you have any centipedes, snakes, scorpions, etc., take some out. The 10 elders' Gu skills are indeed extraordinary. At least the 4th elder had the ability to summon all the scorpions and centipedes nearby to make the old beggar drink, but Tang Ning did not have it. The old beggar occupied 2 copper pots by himself, one for cooking scorpions and one for cooking centipedes. For the sake of what happened just now, Tang Ning stopped arguing with him. The old beggar glanced at him and said, we are all old friends. If you have anything to ask, just ask. Tang Ning looked at the old woman and asked, Do you know Bai Jin? He had ever been a prisoner under the rank. The old woman's face was still a little unnatural. After a while, she said, I have an impression, but I haven't seen each other for decades. Their lineage is very powerful. I heard that they will also compete for the Holy Spirit this time. Female. Tang Ning asked, do you know where they are? The old woman shook her head and said, the 10th meridian is the most mysterious. They have always had a close relationship with the royal family. They have not appeared in Guizhou for more than 10 years since the fall of the Liang kingdom, and there has not been a fight in the past 10 years. Saint. Unexpectedly, the fourth elder did not know where they were, so Tang Ning changed her question and asked, where are the 10 candidates for the sainthood competing for the sainthood? The old woman glanced at the old beggar and saw him remove a scorpion's tail stinger and throw it into his mouth. The bite made a crunching sound. She quickly moved her eyes back and said, Wang Gulin. Tang Ning looked at A Duo and asked, where is Wang Gulin? A Duo shook his head in confusion. Tang Ning looked at the fourth elder and said, you didn't make this up to lie to me, did you? The old beggar glanced at her, and the old woman immediately said, the 10,000 gu forest is the forbidden area of the 10,000 gu section. There are countless poisons in the forest and there are many dangers. Every generation of candidates for the saint must defeat their opponents in the 10,000 gu forest. Can you sit on the throne of a saint? Tang Ning asked, if you can become a saint in this way, why has the position of the saint of Wanggu sect been vacant for so many years? The first generation of saints set a rule that only those who have passed through the 10,000 gu forest can be qualified to be a saint. The old woman glanced at the old beggar again and said, because the 10,000 gus poison sutra was taken away, that generation the saint died early before she had time to pass it down, and she did not learn the superior poison techniques in the poison scripture. No one has ever come back alive from the 10,000 gu forest. Therefore, the position of saint has remained vacant to this day. After hearing her words, Tang Ning finally felt relieved. Su Mei has learned all the 10,000 poisons, which means that even if she enters the 10,000 poisons forest, she will not encounter danger from the outside world. He thought for a moment, then looked at the old woman and asked, since no one can come out of the 10,000 gu forest, why do we let the 10 of them in this time? The fourth elder explained, the poisonous insects in the 10,000 gu forest were all put in by the elders, but the longest-lived poisonous insects can't survive for more than a few decades. After so many years, those ferocious poisonous insects have all died of old age and will no longer pose a big threat to them. She glanced at Tang Ning and added, if you want to find a candidate saint from Baijin's lineage, it's too late now. Tang Ning frowned and asked, why? The old woman looked at him and said, except for our lineage, the other 9 candidates for saints have been 3 days ago, all entered the Wanggu forest. The Wanggu forest is the forbidden area of the Wanggu section. There is only one entrance. No one can enter except the candidate saint and her followers. Tang Ning asked, why haven't you entered yet? 10 days later is the deadline for the candidate saint to enter the Wanggu forest. The old woman paused and said, I wanted to let her in after getting the pair of love gu. Tang Ning glanced at her. The fourth elder did have a good idea. The pair of love gu was already mature gu worms. When they entered the Wanggu forest, the gu worms in the forest dared not get close. When they met the opponent's gu worms were almost useless before they started to fight. How could they fight? However, the candidate saint of the fourth elder's lineage had not entered the Wanggu forest yet, which was a good opportunity for him. It would be better to let him enter the Wanggu forest to find Su Mei than to let him wait outside. The latter would at least make him feel more at ease. Tang Ning took out a porcelain bottle from her sleeve, poured out a red pill, handed it to the fourth elder, and said, eat it. The fourth elder's face changed and asked, what is this? Tang Ning glanced at her and said, if what you said is true, I will give you the antidote when you leave Kyandi. The fourth elder looked gloomy, looked at Tang Ning, then looked at the old beggar squatting in front of the copper pot, took the red pill and swallowed it. When she knew that the heavy-tasting old guy was the crazy beggar back then, she had given up any resistance. She has lived for many years, so she is more afraid of death than anyone else. The person opposite has the power to subvert her life. After watching the fourth elder swallow the pill, Tang Ning continued, I want to enter the Wangu forest. This is impossible. The fourth elder looked at him and shook his head, saying, in addition to the saint, the people who enter the Wangu forest are her followers, and the followers of the saint must also be women. Are you a woman? You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 860. Ruyi Xiaolang Jun Text Volume 855 Calculation. My head hurts. What happened just now? I seem to have fainted suddenly. More than a dozen young men from the Wuxia tribe rubbed their heads and looked at each other in confusion. A duo walked up and said, It's okay, everyone go back and rest. After one person came to his senses, he was shocked and said, I seem to have seen the fourth elder just now. A duo explained, the fourth elder just came. She apologized to us on behalf of Xianju, and then took Xianju away. Everyone looked around, and they all couldn't believe their ears. Xianju wanted to snatch the love gu, which was originally instructed by the fourth elder. They captured Xianju, and it was good enough that the fourth elder didn't seek revenge on them. Why would he apologize to them on behalf of Xianju? A duo ignored them who were confused and turned into a small building somewhere. Inside the small building, Tang Ning looked at the second elder of the Wuxia tribe and asked, Is what she said true or false? The second elder showed a thoughtful look on his face and said, It should be true. I heard from the first elder that the Wangu sect does have a forbidden area. Elder Tian also went in that year, but that place is very mysterious. Apart from the elders in the sect, very few people know where it is. A duo looked at Tang Ning and asked, Brother Tang, are you going to the Wangu forest to find your wife? Tang Ning nodded. A duo thought for a moment and said, I will go with Brother Tang. Tang Ning did not agree with her this time and shook his head. You should stay in the tribe. The 10,000 gu forest is full of dangers. In addition to the countless gu insects, there are other dangers to worry about. If something happens to you, how can I explain it to your family? The second elder looked at Tang Ning and said, It's better to let a duo follow the little doctor. She knows Chinese and can help the little doctor in some places. Moreover, her gu skills are among the best in the tribe and she can take care of herself. A duo nodded repeatedly and said, I will take care of myself. Brother Tang, don't worry about me. A duo and the second elder said so. Tang Ning thought about it carefully and finally agreed. Although he didn't want her to take risks, with the old beggar around, it should be okay to be careful. With a duo around, it would be much easier to communicate with the gu tribe members. After all, so far, she is the best gu tribe member who speaks Chinese that Tang Ning has ever seen. According to the fourth elder, the Wangu forest is heavily guarded and it is difficult for outsiders to enter. Tang Ning himself has no problem, but it is a bit tricky for the old beggar to enter through normal channels. Tang Ning thought about it, looked at the old beggar, and said, I have an immature idea. The old beggar glanced at him and said, Put away your immature idea. Guling tribe. Only a few people knew that Xianju was captured by the Wuxia tribe. When he and the fourth elder returned to the village, everyone greeted him enthusiastically. However, Xianju, who was always lively, lowered his head at this moment and said nothing. If you observe carefully, you will find that his expression is a little haggard and his face is terribly pale. What happened to Xianju? Did he do something wrong and get scolded by the fourth elder? I think so. Judging from his appearance, the fourth elder must have scolded him severely. The fourth elder had a gloomy face all the way and went up to the highest stilt house in the clan. A woman came forward and saw Xianju. Her face lit up when she saw him. She didn't notice that Xianju was desperately winking at her and asked, "Grandma, did you get the love goo?" "Shut up." The old woman glanced at her and said, "Get out." "Grandma." The woman looked at her in a daze. Just as she was about to speak, she was pulled out by Xianju. Outside the small building, the woman shook off his hand and said dissatisfiedly, "What are you doing?" Xianju sighed, looked at her, and said, "We've got into big trouble this time." After hearing what Xianju said, the woman's face gradually turned pale. Inside the small building, the old woman sat cross-legged on the bed. She practiced for a long time and didn't notice anything different in her body. But the more she did so, the more frightened she became. This means that with her ability, she could not find or cure the poison in the red pill she took. Even though she was proficient in poison, she could not guarantee that she could understand the world's strange poisons. After taking a few detoxifying pills, she still did not feel anything in her body. The old woman finally gave up and her face became even gloomier. Fortunately, the man said that when he left Kizhu, he would cure the poison in her body. Until now, she can only pin her hopes on him keeping his promise. At a certain moment, someone knocked on the door outside, and the old woman asked in a deep voice, "What's the matter?" Xianju said outside the door, "Grandma, the eighth elder is here and wants to see you." "What is he doing here?" A trace of doubt flashed across the old woman's face. After a moment, she slowly said, "Please let him in." Not long after, an old man with white hair and beard pushed the door open. The old woman looked at him and asked, "What are you doing here?" The old man sat on a chair in the room and said, "It's been decades, and your temper hasn't changed at all." Even if the person opposite was the fourth elder of the Wangu sect, he talked to him without any awe or politeness. This is because his identity is also extraordinary. He is not only one of the 10 elders, but also, like the fourth elder, one of the few who has firmly sat on the position of elder decades ago. Over the years, I don't know how many elders have been replaced in the remaining lines. The 4th, 8th, and 9th lines have remained firm and unmoving after decades. The old woman looked indifferently and said, "If you have something to say, just say it, and if you don't have anything to do, leave." The old man had long been accustomed to her temper and didn't care. He asked, "I heard that the 2 old guys from the Wuxia tribe are dead." When the old woman heard this, a glimmer of light appeared in her eyes. The next moment, she looked at him and said in a deep voice, "Don't blame me for not reminding you, those 2 Love-Gu belong to our ancient spiritual department." A smile appeared on the old man's face and he said, "The saints chosen by your lineage have been delaying entering the Holy Land just to wait for these 2 Love-Gus, right?" The old woman snorted coldly and asked, "So what?" The old man looked at her and said, "In the 10,000 Gu forest, everything is unknown. Even if you get those 2 Love-Gus, you may not be able to successfully sit on the throne of the saint." The old woman said, "The 8th elder doesn't have to worry about it. Think of good intentions as a donkey's liver and lungs." The 8th elder stood up, glanced at her, and said, "I came here today just for the sake of past kindness. I would like to remind you that this time I finally restarted the fight for the saint, and every vein has left a trace. As a backup, even if you kill the Silver Thread Snake King." Halfway through his words, the old man was suddenly startled and asked, "Your silver-threaded Snake King is not on you. Did you really give it to Niju?" Naturally, the old woman would not tell him that the precious silver-threaded Snake King had become a meal for others. She glanced at the 8th elder coldly and said, "This is none of your business. Let me warn you, don't go get the idea of Love-Gu." The 8th elder waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, I'm here just to remind you that I have no interest in Love-Gu at all." After he finished speaking, he turned around and walked out. However, after walking out of the small building, an inexplicable smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. How could he not be interested in this pair of mature lovebirds in Gizhu? With this pair of love goo in hand, he will be unbeatable in the whole of Gizhu. However, with his back to the door, he did not notice the old woman sitting cross-legged on the bed, watching him go out, with a gloating smile on her face. In the wuxia department, Tang Ning threw a red pill into his mouth. A duo looked at him and asked, "Brother Tang, what are you eating?" "Elixirs are for replenishing physical strength." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Do you want one?" A duo stretched out her hand sheepishly, and Tang Ning poured 2 pills into her hand. A duo looked at him and asked, "Brother Tang, is your wife the saint of the 10th lineage?" Before Tang Ning could answer, there was a sudden bang at the door of the room. The door of the small building was wide open, and an old man stood at the door. He glanced around the room, stayed in the corner for a moment, and asked, "Excuse me, is Elder Yangju here?" A duo shook his head and said, "There are no elders in our tribe who look up to us for a long time." The old man was stunned for a moment, then apologized, "I'm sorry to bother you." He stretched out his hand and was about to close the door and leave when a voice came from the corner. "Wait a minute." The old beggar who was threading centipedes on bamboo sticks stood up, looked at him, and said, "You look familiar." The old man laughed dryly and said, "We have never met before." The old beggar thought for a while, looked at him and said, "Take off your clothes and let me see." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 861. Tang Ning threw a red pill to the 8th elder of Wangu sect and said, "Take it." The old man's expression changed, he glanced at the old beggar, and finally swallowed the pill with a stern face. Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Be patient during this period. When we leave Gizhu, we will give you the antidote." The 8th elder nodded and bowed and exited. After walking out of the door, his face showed a look of solemnity, and he said angrily, "Damn old woman, you actually plotted against me." In the small building, a duo looked at the 8th elder who disappeared outside the door, and felt that there was no big disturbance in his heart. The top 10 elders were once aloof and respected by thousands of people. However, after seeing their true colors, the awe and fear of them in my heart was gone. They are also human beings. Like most people, they are also greedy, lustful, and afraid of death. Compared with them, they just live a little longer. The second elder handed the 2 bamboo tubes to Tang Ning and said, "Little doctor, I will leave these 2 bamboo tubes to you. With the strength of our wuxia tribe, we cannot protect them, but they will be killed." Because of these 2 gu, 2 of the 10,000 gu sect's 10 elders came. Without the old beggar, Tang Ning would not be able to handle it alone. Tang Ning took the bamboo tube and couldn't help but glance at the old beggar. This was probably the first time he felt that taking him out this time was a wise decision. In Gizhu, his face is the biggest intimidation and can be used to ward off evil spirits. If he wanted to control Gizhu, he wouldn't need to seize any saints. He could just find the current 10 elders and defeat them. Of course, most of the consequences of violence are violence. If they cannot be convinced, sooner or later there will be trouble. There was another reason why Tang Ning didn't let the old beggar do this, and that was that he came here just to pick up his wife and had no intention of taking control of Gizhu. Whether he could become a saint or not, whether he could help Bai Jinggong Sun Ying regain the Liang Kingdom, these were not his considerations. Temporarily controlling the 4th elder and the 8th elder was to prevent them from acting rashly by the wuxia tribe. Even if Tang Ning wanted to leave Qiandi after finding Su Mei, she would help the wuxia tribe completely solve this problem before leaving. Before that, he planned to solve the problem of Gu first. Gu is not originally a high-level Gu insect, and its function is also very simple. It is limited to those men and women who show kindness to restrain each other. Their combat effectiveness is not high, and they are not looked down upon by Gu masters. However, these two Gu have existed for too long. Over the past few decades, they have absorbed the essence and blood nutrients of the two elders every night, although in the end they will feed it back to the continuation of the host's life. But 80 years have passed, which is enough for them to grow into a terrifying situation. When ordinary Gu insects see them, they are like beasts meeting the king of beasts. Under the pressure of the superior's aura, they can't even think of resisting. After the death of the two elders, these two Gu emerged from the body. You only need to feed a few with your own blood to get their recognition as their master. This is also Gu's only chance to recognize his master after breaking his body. Because of the characteristics of the voodoo, some people would even use others as a furnace to cultivate the voodoo, and when the voodoo matures, they would take it and claim it as their master. Tang Ning had no intention of becoming the master of these two Gu. He always felt that there were bugs on his clothes, which made him uncomfortable. If it weren't for the crisis in Guizhou, he would not have carried these things at all. In the words of the old beggar, these are all heresies, and they are all vulnerable to absolute strength. Old Zheng didn't know the art of Gu, and the old beggar had never used it before, but he was still able to hang up and beat the 10 elders of the 10,000 Gu section. Tang Ning still envied them and didn't want to deal with these bugs all day long. Tang Ning did not reject the second elder's idea of letting him deal with the Gu, but how to deal with it was a problem. There must be many people who know about the news that there is a pair of Gu in the Wuxia tribe. Even if they are destroyed, no one may believe it. It would be better for their Wuxia tribe to cultivate a strong man themselves. Only unrivaled strength is the best deterrent to the young people. After the Gu breaks out of the body, the male and female Gu will never be separated again. Even if they recognize their master, they will only identify with one master. Now that the matter is over, everyone must have known about the Gu in the Wuxia tribe. Tang Ning looked at the second elder and said, "Why don't you give these two Gu to the elders, and you can choose one of them? Accept the Lord." The second elder shook his head and said, "We old guys, I'm afraid we will have to see the first elder in a few years. Gu will break the body and we can only recognize the master once. It's better not to waste it on us old guys." What the second elder said makes sense. Gu is the trump card of the Wuxia tribe. Once the master is recognized, outsiders will not dare to offend the Wuxia tribe easily. Unless they are life-threatening lunatics, even the top 10 elders will not dare to do it because of one thing. To deal with the Gu worms, they would massacre the entire Wuxia tribe. In this way, they would become the enemies of the entire Gu tribe. As long as the Gu insect recognizes its master, they can only stop trying to rob it. What the Wuxia tribe needs is a young backer who can protect them for a long time after Gu recognizes his master. Tang Ning looked at the girl who was sitting on the steps in front of the small building, looking at the mountains in the distance in a daze. She walked forward and said, "A duo, I have something to discuss with you." Ancient Spiritual Department. 8th Elder. I've met the 8th Elder. The 8th Elder walked in the village with a serious expression, and the tribesmen along the way saluted him one after another. Xianju came up to him, and just as he opened his mouth, the 8th Elder glared back at him as he was about to say something. The 8th Elder looked at him and said solemnly, "Where is Xianyi?" Not knowing why the 8th Elder was so angry, Xianju was startled and said, The 4th Elder is up there." The 8th Elder looked at the stilted building at the top. Xianju felt an afterimage appeared in front of his eyes, and the 8th Elder's shadow had disappeared in front of him. Boom! The door of the tallest stilted building in the ancient spiritual department burst into pieces. The 8th Elder walked in, looked at the old woman, and said angrily, "How dare you plot against me?" The 4th Elder looked at him with a smile on his lips and said, "What did I plot against you?" The 8th Elder gritted his teeth and said, "That man is in the Wuxia tribe, why didn't you tell me?" "Did I ask you to go to the Wuxia tribe?" The 4th Elder sneered and said, "I told you that I won't let you interfere in the Wuxia tribe's affairs, but you insist on interfering, and now you blame me. You evil bitch, how dare you plot against me?" The eighth elder looked at her, with a trace of murderous intent on his face, and said solemnly, "I want your life." The fourth elder stood up and said coldly, "Just try it." Boom. The tribesmen of the Guling tribe were working in the fields when they suddenly heard a loud noise. When they raised their heads, they saw the stilt building at the highest point of the village, which symbolized the highest power of the Guling tribe. Collapse. After 10. Kyandi, somewhere in an unknown valley. Kizhu is mountainous, and some places have pleasant scenery and contrasting mountains and rivers. People of all ethnic groups cultivated fields and built their own villages here, forming tribal groups of different sizes. However, most of the mountains and forests in Kizhu are uninhabited primitive mountains and forests, which are filled with ferocious beasts and miasma. Even the Gu people who grew up in the mountains are not willing to go deep into these places. Somewhere in the silent primitive mountain forest, the sound of rustling footsteps suddenly came. More than 10 figures appeared on the mountain road. Going up the mountain road, the road became narrower and narrower. At the end, only one person could pass. After passing through the last narrow mountain road, we came to an open field. On the venue, there were already several figures waiting. A white-haired old woman looked at the fourth elder and said, "I thought your fourth lineage wouldn't come this time. How can we miss the battle between saints?" The fourth elder glanced at her and said, "Did we miss the time?" The old woman said, "After another hour, you won't be able to enter." "Then it's too late." The fourth elder handed her a piece of silk, and the old woman looked up. Written on this piece of silk are the names of the saint and the 10 guardians. Niju. She glanced at the fourth elder and said, "For your granddaughter, the fourth elder has put a lot of thought into this time." Her eyes continued to move downward, and there were the names of the 10 guardians. She glanced at the people behind Niju and said in her mouth, "Wuzang, Wuxiu, Jamo, Judi, Wuduo, Tang Ning Ning." Her eyes lingered on the last woman for a moment, and she said, "What a rare surname."